I'm Anna,
I'm Jessica.
and this is the Paranoia Pair.
It's finally here. The first part of the two-part series on Ervil LeBaron. I was not kidding when I said I had 20 pages of notes. So I'm just gonna get into it. The LeBarons were basically fundamentalist Mormon royalty. They were part of a long-running offshoot that believed that plural marriage was a divine commandment that mainstream LDS leaders have abandoned when the church outlawed polygamy in 1890 to keep Utah a state. Ervil's father, Alma Dayer LeBaron, was one of these die-hard fundamentalists. In the 1920s and 30s, he believed polygamy was the original form of pure Mormonism. The LeBarons also believed that their family line descended from a priesthood authority that predated the LDS Church abandoning polygamy. They literally thought their bloodline was chosen to, quote, restore true Mormonism. So he moved his entire family to northern Mexico, specifically the Mormon colonies near Chihuahua, where U.S. law had no authority and couldn't reach him. It was here in northern Mexico that the LeBaron children grew up surrounded by poverty, strict religious practices, and the idea that their family was spiritually chosen. When Alma died, his sons, specifically Joel and Ervil, believed one of them should lead a continuation of God's true church. And that's kind of where this power struggle between the two begins. In the 1950s and 60s, the LeBaron brothers formed what they called the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. The leadership didn't stay peaceful for long. Joel was more stable, and he was the more level-headed brother. He became prophet. And Ervil, meanwhile, he was charismatic, intelligent, persuasive, and also incredibly unhinged. He wanted control, he wanted power, and he believed that God wanted him to have it. And this tension split the family. In 1972, Ervil had fully broken from Joel's church, and he claimed that he was the rightful prophet, and he founded his own. His church was called the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God. And Joel's church had about 1,000 members. When Ervil left, he took about 100 of them with him. Ervil preached that he alone held the priesthood keys to the kingdom of God. Ervil preached an early Mormon belief that certain sinners needed to have their blood shed to be forgiven by God. This was called blood atonement. And what made Ervil's group especially dangerous was that most of his followers were literally his own children and wives. So when your cult is built basically of your own offspring, loyalty becomes a family obligation. Ervil had 14 wives: Delfina Salido, Marilu Vega, Joy Marston, Anna Mae Marston, Lorna Chinoth, Christina Jensen, Rosemary Barlow, Linda Johnson, Deborah Bateman. Deborah was only 16 years old when they got married. Vonda White, Teresa Rios, Yolanda Rios, and a woman named Lynette, who I couldn't find a last name for, and Rena Chinoth. And Rena was also 16 when she married Ervil. Rena says that Ervil had been interested in her since she was around 12. And what's even worse is that he was not the only one interested in her. He was just the one that was the most persistent. He wasn't interested in him. She respected him as a prophet, but did not want anything to do with him and did not want to marry him. We are going to kind of get into that a bit more, but Ervil had more than 50 children. Um, which is so many children that reading their names out loud would basically make this episode become an audiobook, and I am not going to be doing that. So, as you can imagine, living conditions were not great. One of Ervil's daughters was literally born on a mattress that was moved off of the floor and put on top of a table. That house also had no running water or electricity. And the closest town to the colony was an hour away, so they were very secluded and they hardly left. There was also some drama going on where Ervil was taking other people's wives as his own because Ervil was the quote, one and mighty. He was receiving revelations apparently, and he was being told who should be married to who. And would you guess it, God wanted Ervil to marry other men's wives. He was playing some kind of weird, fucked up game of matchmaking. So remember the whole blood atonement thing? Well, apparently Ervil started preaching that if people didn't start paying their tithes and supporting Ervil, then they were going to be killed because, of course, nothing says loving religion like threatening to murder your followers over missed payments. Am I right? Who's with me? What else screams loving religion? Practicing military drills. Ervil started bringing guns into the colony, and everybody was getting trained, even the children. Guys, the children were shooting machine guns. So Ervil is building a militia, but don't worry, it's all in the name of Jesus. Dan Jordan was Ervil's right-hand man in all of this. He was very stern, strict, and aggressive, and they kind of fed off of each other's hatred of the world. Ervil would promise men his daughters hand in marriage. And that was kind of in a way to hold power over people and manipulate them into giving him what he wanted, which was full devotion and loyalty. When one of his daughters was 15, Ervil had a quote, revelation, and she was to marry Dan Jordan. Again, she was 15. Dan Jordan, 42. One of her stepsisters also had to marry Dan as well. They were married to Dan the same night. Dan flipped a coin to determine who slept with him on their wedding night, which is absolutely disgusting. These children truly believed that Ervil was a prophet and that he got revelations from God because that's what they were told growing up. That's all they believed. So they didn't question it. They were not allowed to question it. So they just did what they were told. One day, Dan Jordan came into Sunday school with a gun, and all of the adults started whispering to each other. Ervil had ordered for Joel to be killed because he believed that Joel was standing in the way of his divine right to lead because Joel also claimed to be a prophet. He also had a deep hatred for Joel that stemmed from when they ran the firstborn church together. And this is because Ervil has a sense of entitlement and a superiority complex, which I think is pretty common for men who claim to be a prophet of God. Anywho, Ervil felt that Joel treated him as a subordinate instead of someone who was chosen by God. Joel wasn't very accepting of Ervil's teachings about blood atonement or purging apostates and eliminating everybody who opposes them in the church of the firstborn. Joel thought it was violent and extreme and that Ervil was becoming dangerous. So Joel excommunicated Ervil. This was humiliating. Not only that, but it was also spiritually devastating because in their beliefs, losing your priesthood means that you are no longer legitimate. And there was also people who noticed a change in Ervil after all of the money was coming in from people paying their tithes. Ervil was using this money to buy himself a gold Cadillac. He also didn't work to support his ever-growing family, which rubbed people the wrong way. Ervil preached that Joel was a false prophet and that he's leading people astray and that God wants Joel to be removed. He tells followers that Joel is, quote, blocking the restoration of God's true order. And this is how he justifies Joel's murder. On August 20th, 1972, in Ensenada, Baja California, Mexico, Dan Jordan and another follower of Ervil's go to an abandoned shack. They lure Joel to meet them at this shack, likely under the guise of wanting to rejoin Joel's church. What ended up happening is that Dan and this other follower beat Joel with a chair leg, and then Dan shot Joel LeBaron in the head. Members of Joel's church went to police and told them that they knew Ervil was behind the murder and that they had seen Dan Jordan with Joel the day he was killed. Baja police then start investigating and looking for Ervil, but they don't know where Ervil is and no one can find Dan. Ervil would get revelations and just start moving people around. One of the wives and their children moved around 10 to 15 times. He started moving wives to California, Texas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. They were also moved around in the back of a moving truck. When they moved to Denver, there was 3 wives and 20 kids living in a 1,500 square foot house. The kids weren't allowed to play outside. They had to stay indoors, and they were taught not to trust the outside world or police. If they were ever to be questioned, they were instructed to say they didn't know for every single question. Each of the wives got a bedroom, and in the corner of each bedroom was a pile of blankets that the kids would grab from at night, and then they would just find a place in the house to lay down and go to sleep. To be able to afford things and earn some money, they ended up opening an appliance repair business. They called it Michael's Appliance, because apparently Michael was God's name, I guess. They opened it to do, quote, God's work. Michael's Appliance would bring money in, and then they would send that money to Ervil. And the way he would spend the money really was kind of all over the place. He used it for attorney fees. He also used it for cars, and basically anything he wanted to spend it on, he would. The sons were taught how to repair things so they could work for the business. And the daughters were all sent to do the cleaning once they were deemed old enough. So at about 9 or 10, the girls would be sent to the warehouse to work 6 days a week. And they were working 10-hour days. If Dan came in and you weren't working, he would scream his head off at you. And the kids were terrified of him. The kids weren't allowed to complain either, because it was taught that feeling sorry for yourself was the first step of insanity, and insanity was the equivalent of being possessed by the devil. So they just did what they were told, and after they got off of work at 9 o'clock at night, they would either go dumpster diving, gardening, or go to Goodwill to do, quote, gift boxing, which just meant that they would take all of the donations left by people that would fit any of the kids. So like dumpster diving at Goodwill. 4 months after Joel's murder, after all of this running, Ervil just walks into the police station in Ensenada and demands that the charges be dropped against him. And he sat in jail for about a year awaiting trial. So while Ervil was being held in Mexico, awaiting trial for Joel's murder, one of Ervil's own wives, Maria de la Cruz, went to visit him. During these visits, she would bring him food, except she wasn't just bringing him food. She also would bring him a little something extra. Y'all, they were getting it on in the jail cell. She was bringing him casserole and coochie, and this did result in her getting pregnant. Ervil was tried and convicted in Mexico for Joel's murder, and he was sentenced to 12 years. And this is where you think the story ends. But then you remember, this episode has only been going on for 20 minutes, and she said it was a 2-parter. That's because the next day after his conviction, he was released by a higher court on a technicality. It's been rumored, though, that he was released after he paid a bribe, and in the mind of his followers, this was all just an act of God, and it was proof in their minds that he was the true prophet, and he got away with murder. So now Ervil is setting his sights on another brother, Verlin, and that's because Verlin took over as president of Joel's church. So you could see that there really was no end to the list of targets, and it didn't matter who they were. All that mattered was that Ervil wanted them dead. After this, his teachings escalated into full-blown religious hit lists because Ervil wants more power, he wants more money, he wants more women, he wants more guns, and he wants more followers. This man cannot be satisfied. The day after Christmas in 1974, at the Los Molinos compound, there was an explosion. Molotov cocktails were being thrown at houses, and people start screaming and running out of their homes. And waiting outside are men with guns who open fire on everybody. 2 people died, a 16-year-old named Monroe Melendez and 19-year-old Edmundo Aguilar. 19 others were injured, and of course, this was all orchestrated by who other than Ervil, and this was part of his plan to seize control over the LeBaron legacy and to punish those who followed someone other than him. He was hoping to flush out Erlin and have him killed, but Verlin knew he was a target, so he, like Ervil, didn't stay in one spot for too long. With the attempt on Verlin's life being a failure, Ervil had a new mission from God. A new list of people who needed to be blood atoned. On the list was Rulon Alred. Rulon was the leader of a rival polygamist group, and he was practicing in Salt Lake City even though polygamy was outlawed in the United States. Rulon had 7 wives, and I think he had about 48 children. He was living pretty modestly, and his church was bringing in a lot of money, which is likely what sparked Ervil's jealousy. When Ervil decided Rulon needed to die, he called on who other than his bestie Dan Jordan to plan it out with him. So together, they picked 2 of the wives to send on a mission to kill Rulon Alred. And these wives had to do what they were told, or else they themselves would become a target. Dan's wife, Ramona, and Ervil's wife, Raina, were both chosen to execute Rulon Alred. They went to Rulon's doctor's office where he worked and went into the little reception area, and Raina shot him 4 times while Ramona just kind of stood there frozen. The doctor's office starts to panic, and Raina calmly walks out, but Ramona is stopped by a man, preventing her from leaving. And then Raina pointed a gun at him and tells him to let her go. Raina then turns to Ramona and said that she's not sure that Dr. Alred is dead. So they go back in to see that he's gasping for air, and they were instructed to make sure that he was dead, so she shot him in the face. When the police began investigating, they didn't really have much to go on because there wasn't any fingerprints on the shell casings at the scene, and there wasn't any way for them to identify the 2 women who had killed Rulon. They came into the doctor's office wearing wigs, and they were dressed fully in bulky clothing. There was kind of a general consensus a few days after the murder that 2 women had killed Rulon Alred because they were feminists and they didn't agree with the polygamous lifestyle that he was living. Police began questioning if these 2 women did it on their own free will or if they were hired to carry it out. Rulon's family and his followers believed that Ervil was behind it all. He was the only person who had threatened Rulon and even sent him a few death threats. Ervil also sent a few followers up to Salt Lake City who threatened Rulon, and they even left a note on his car. I couldn't really figure out what that note said, but then the truth comes out that not only was Rulon a leader of a rival polygamous church who was respected by the community, but he was also very close friends with Verlin, and Ervil was hoping that this murder would help him find his brother because certainly his brother would not miss the funeral of one of his closest friends, right? Ervil had planned on killing Verlin when he showed up to the funeral. Cut to the news, and other polygamists are saying that they know it was Ervil who had Rulon killed, and if nothing was done about it, there would be even more murders. One woman even said that her own life was threatened by Ervil's followers, but police have almost nothing to go on, and suddenly they get their first break. 2 men who were dumpster diving for cans to recycle for money find an empty gun case for a .38 Smith & Wesson. The police find the serial number on the box and trace it back to a gun shop in Denver, Colorado. Just a week earlier, a woman named Nancy had purchased the same gun. Nancy is married to a man named Victor, and they have a daughter named Serena, aka Rena, who just so happens to be Ervil's 13th wife. So now that they've made that connection, different agencies are now on the hunt for Ervil. And the FBI puts him on the top most wanted list. This is causing a bunch of panic, and they're now referring to Ervil as the Mormon Manson because just a decade earlier, Charles Manson had basically done this same thing where he had his followers kill people. So now that phase 1, aka killing Rulon, is complete, they start phase 2, which is the funeral. And as he had planned, Verlin attends the funeral. Also at the funeral, though, is a heavy police presence. That doesn't stop Ervil because he has a car outside the funeral that's full of men with guns. Well, the men that are in the car with the guns realize, wow, there's a lot of police here, and they start to question if they'll be able to kill Verlin before getting killed themselves. They don't think they can pull it off, so they leave. But these men were sent on this, quote, divine mission, and they failed to carry it out. So now they're probably like, oh my god, now I'm going to get killed next, because that's how it worked with Ervil. Now that police have an eye on Ervil, they're noticing something a little weird. It seems that Ervil is connected in some kind of way to all of these other disappearances and murders, including his own daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca came from Ervil's first marriage, and she would kind of babysit the younger kids. And around the time when she was about 17, she was expecting her second child, but then all of a sudden she disappeared. But this was kind of normal in this lifestyle. People were moved around all the time, so no one really thought anything of it. And she also was kind of struggling with her mental health, and she really did not agree with the plural lifestyle. This made her be seen as a liability to the group, so some of Ervil's followers took her out to the mountains, and they strangled her to death and buried her in a shallow grave. At this time, the police still have no idea that Ramona is involved with the murder of Rulon, and now Rena is wanted by the law and is on the run. So Ramona and Rena are in Mexico, and they instruct the kids to now call Rena by the name Patty. The kids don't really know why they need to start calling Rena Patty, but they listen and do it anyway because, again, they're taught to just obey and do what they're told. In one of the houses they're staying in, they have a hidden door, like the old classic room behind a bookcase. So if anyone is on the run or in hiding, they can just go into that room and nobody would know. Ervil's followers are also really good at staying ahead of the police. They're constantly moving people around, changing names, changing the cars they're driving, and changing the motels that they're staying in. Months go by, and the police don't come any closer to solving anything until Ervil's first wife comes forward to the police with their son Isaac, and he's about 15 at the time. After Rebecca went missing, Isaac and Delphina questioned Ervil about what had happened to Rebecca. They feel like something bad had happened to her, and they don't want to believe that Ervil is capable of killing his own daughter, because if he's capable of killing his own daughter, he's capable of killing anybody, including his wives. So Isaac comes forward and says that his father has been threatening to kill him. Isaac and Delphina are putting their lives on the line to expose what Ervil has done, because if anyone goes against Ervil or starts to have any doubt, their lives are taken under the guise of blood atonement. Isaac names Rena as the one who pulled the trigger and Ramona as her accomplice. He also names 2 men who were involved in the Los Molinos raid. Eddie Marston, and Rena's brother, Mark Chanoth. Mark joined Ervil's cult when he was young. He was very musically talented and he played piano. He was also a loyal follower of Ervil. He was involved in multiple killings, and Isaac was actually in the meetings Ervil had with Mark and Dan about the murders, so he was able to testify against him, and he really was the last missing piece the police needed to connect everything. November 7th, 1979, law enforcement organized a multi-state raid on the LeBarons' homes. Businesses ran by the cult, safe houses, vehicles, and suspected meeting places all around the country. San Diego, Houston, Salt Lake City, Denver, Nogales, and Tucson, as well as parts of Mexico. And the wives explained to the children that they were God's chosen people, and God's chosen people are persecuted. In these raids, the police found weapons, planned murders, fake IDs, documents from Ervil about blood atonement killings, as well as documents tying members to Rulon Allred's death. What they didn't find in the raids, though, were Ervil, Ramona, or Rena. A few months later, the kids were woken up in the middle of the night and loaded into a car. They were given a grocery bag that they had to fill with some clothes because Ervil had a revelation that his children in Denver were in danger. They were split up between some of his loyal followers in Mexico. One of the followers was Andres, and they were put to work immediately. One day, one of Ervil's daughters, Anna, came home, and Andres sits her down on the bed, and he's rubbing her legs and says to her, "Let's talk about love." She was fucking 9 years old, and he is grooming her already to be his wife one day. In the documentary, Anna was talking about how she just was really scared, and she was just hoping that maybe one day someone would save her. During this time, Ervil is hiding out in Mexico, and he goes and visits Andres' house. And this is the first time Anna meets her father. The first time. She's 9 years old, and she's just in complete awe of him. She can't believe he's there and that he knows her name, literally admiring him while he's writing on a legal pad. And he asked her to make him a cup of coffee, and she said it was equal to God himself asking her to make him a cup of coffee. So if you're wondering what Ervil was writing in his legal pad, I'll tell ya. Letters to the media. Homeboy even wrote a letter to the president, Jimmy Carter, and said that he needed to pay Ervil a 10% tithe. Of course, he was also writing threats and revelations. He really did think he was untouchable. And about 6 months after Anna and her brother arrived to Andre's home, Rena and Dan had been visiting. One night they were woken up by a loud banging at the door, and Anna's brother Hiram wasn't fully awake. He was about 6 years old at the time. He walked over and he opened the front door, and a group of men just pushed their way inside. All of the children were herded into a back room, and the adults were moved to a separate room, and Rena was questioned and arrested. They tore apart that entire house looking for Ervil. Close by, another house had been raided, and that is where they find him. Ervil admits who he is. But for some reason, the cops just don't believe him. I guess he looked so disheveled and old. They were like, there's no way anyone would follow this man, and that he's lying to protect the real Ervil. So they go back to Dan, who was at the home Rena was arrested in, and asked him if he was the real Ervil. And of course, Dan says yes. So they arrest Dan as Ervil LeBaron, but the real Ervil is still free. I think this is where I'm going to end this. I'm about halfway through my notes. This guy, I told you, He's unhinged.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook at Paranoia Pair Pod. And we will see you next Friday.
Stay spooky.
Bye.